Al meer dan 40 jaar bestudeert hij de sterren en reist hij heen en weer tussen Castel Gandolfo in Rome en Tuscon in Amerika. Father COYNE is Amerikaan van geboorte. Hij studeerde wiskunde, filosofie, theologie, doctoreerde in de astronomie en is thans president van de Vaticaanse sterrenwachten. Vandaag is Father COYNE op uitnodiging van de faculteit theologie in Leuven en ik praat met hem in de Arenberg bibliotheek. Father COYNE, welcome to our program. You have been studying the stars for more than 30 years, but you also became a Jesuit at the age of 18. What reactions do you get now, being a priest and an astronomer?
Well, I think most people, at least those in my own profession, say at the University of Arizona, a big state university in the States, are very comfortable with it. I mean, I'm a scientist, like any of them are, but they are curious. Not just myself, we're 14 Jesuits on the Vatican Observatory staff, and most of us are involved in working with our colleagues who are agnostic, atheist, believing Christians, Jewish, have what you will.
Father COYNE, you were a director of the Vatican Observatory for 28 years.
That's correct.
What are your most moving moments during that period?
You know, I'm not trying to avoid your question, but the whole period was a very special time for me in my life. If I were to pick out a moving moment, it would have to be against the background of I became director at exactly the time that John Paul II became Pope. In fact, I was appointed director by John Paul I, but he only lived for 32 days. So essentially, I came in as director at the same time that John Paul II became Pope. And his papacy, from the very beginning, one of the important things he saw was the opening of the church to science. So one of the first things he did in the first year of his papacy, he began to talk about having a commission to reinvestigate the Galileo case. Just one example of how he wanted to open the church to science, because he saw the Galileo case as continuing to be a negative influence on the church's opening to science. That a lot of scientists saw what he called a myth, that this contrast that the church had with Galileo was intrinsic, that the church and science were enemies from within. And that's not true. He saw it wasn't true. And he wanted to say that the Galileo case is an exceptional case, and I want it to be investigated so that we know what went wrong on either side of the question. But that was just one example. In 1987, after about a decade of his papacy, we celebrated the 300th anniversary of Newton's Principia, the great book which started modern science. And the Pope asked us, how do we celebrate it at the Vatican Observatory? And we said, Your Holiness, you know, rather than have a parade with balloons and all of this, just jokingly, let's have a conference. And let's bring together philosophers, scientists, theologians to discuss some of our common concerns. And we did. And he wrote a magnificent message in the preface to the book that was published that is called Physics, Philosophy, and Theology. And it's a magnificent message that I think sets the tone for the meeting of church and science. So against that background, I would say one of the most rewarding and things that I look back with pride was when we needed to modernize the Vatican Observatory. We could no longer observe at Castel Gandolfo, which is just 20 miles southeast of Rome. Rome had grown, the towns around had grown, the lights were making the sky too bright. We call it light pollution, so that we could no longer carry on our observational programs. And we proposed various possibilities, and John Paul II personally very much supported we opening a research institute in Arizona. It was a dramatic move because previous popes, in their own time, you have to judge popes by their own time, did not want the observatory to move from Vatican or Italian territory. This was a pope who saw the need and saw the great opportunity we had to be at the forefront of modern science, because in Arizona, the great initiatives were growing to build the world's next largest telescope.
Did this universe come about by chance or by necessity?
Well, first of all, as any good scientist, we distinguish, did the universe come about by chance or necessity? Now, I'm talking as a scientist. I don't know. I don't know. As a scientist now I'm talking. Because I cannot, as a scientist, explore the very beginning of the universe. And in fact, I cannot know with certainty if it had a beginning. It could have been forever, the universe. And that's because from within science itself, quantum mechanics teaches us that there is an uncertainty that is reflected in the beginning of the universe. I cannot look back to what we call the Big Bang. So with that said, once the universe began, has it developed by chance or necessity? Did we come about in this universe by chance or necessity, which is a much more significant problem, our own origins in the universe? Number one, we are part of a universe in evolution. We came about, like stars came about, galaxies came about, stars, galaxies, all these components. We came about in this universe in evolution, talking as a scientist. It's neither by chance or necessity, it's by both. But it's by both, because the classical question, chance or necessity, is not adequate to modern science.
It's not a good question.
It's not a good question if left that way. It's both chance and necessity in what I call a fertile universe. Fertile universe is essentially a universe that is 14 billion years old. So that's a lot older than life. So relatively speaking, it's a very old universe. In that universe, there are 10 to the 22nd stars. So that's 1 with 22 zeros behind it. 100 is 2 zeros, 1,000 is 3, etc. This is 1 with 22 zeros. Stars. Each of those stars is born and it dies. As it's born by converting hydrogen to helium. It lives by converting hydrogen to helium to carbon up the periodic table. When it dies, depending on its mass, it will have created heavier elements, and it spews those elements out to the universe at its death. After 3 generations of stars, because a first generation dies, another generation is born out of that material, which is no longer pure hydrogen. It's been enriched with the heavier elements. The sun is a 3rd generation star. And we would not be here if the sun were not a 3rd generation star. Because the amount of carbon that you need to make a toenail or an earlobe or an amoeba could not have been in the universe until 3 generations of stars.
So we are stardust.
We're born
My body
of
is
stardust. We're stardust.
Yeah.
Now, I have a professor who teaches the same thing, and he tells his students we're born of thermonuclear waste. Well, it's the same reality, but I see you're smiling much more if I tell you it's stardust. Now, what's chance and necessity have to do with it?
Yes.
Take 2 hydrogen atoms in the early universe. They meet. They have to make a hydrogen molecule. So that's what I mean by necessity. That's the laws of chemistry. But they don't at this time and place because the temperature and pressure conditions are not correct. So they wander throughout the universe.
How
There are
long?
trillions of them over this long period of time.
Yes.
What's to surprise us if a few million times, billion times, we get a hydrogen molecule? If we get 2 of them and it meets oxygen, it has to make water. So what I'm saying, without going on any more, is that necessary processes are taking place, but by chance. It's not pure chance. It's a driven chance, but chance is part of the process. But it's happening in a fertile universe, as I've explained. So inevitably, not necessarily, because if I said necessarily, I would deny that chance is already involved. It's inevitable because chemistry is that way. The more complicated a chemical, the more determined its future is. Hydrogen can become anything. Methane, amino acid, DNA, protein, its future is more determined. And so there is an intrinsic kind of destiny, direction to it. But that does not, for a scientist, that does not require an intelligent design to it all. It doesn't exclude it, it doesn't include it. I'm talking as a scientist. So the question is, did this happen by chance or necessity is not adequate.
It is a beautiful story, but what place for a creator?
A magnificent creator, if I believe. It's a big if, because I can only step outside of science in order to introduce this if. If I believe in God, and I do, and I believe in God, I have reasons to believe in God, but they're not adequate.
They're not scientific.
God transcends all of my knowledge of science, all of my reasoning process in philosophy or theology. God gave himself to me freely. Faith is God's gift to me of himself. And I accepted that gift. And I've thought about it. And it's coherent with everything I know, but it goes beyond everything I know. If you accept that, and if I now use my science to reflect what kind of creator, I believe God created this universe, what kind of God would create a universe like this? A magnificent God.
But let me ask you once again, because I don't quite get it. You say that the universe, you don't need to have a creator in a scientific way to believe in this coming about of the universe, but on the other hand, you say, I believe in a creator God. So that's quite opposite. And they exist in one mind, in your mind, two different opinions.
No, they're not two different opinions, they're the big if.
Oh,
I mean,
see.
the balance.
Yes.
You know, I may be schizophrenic, but I'm not schizophrenic because of my religious belief and my scientific research. They come together by my reflecting with the big if. If I believe in God, and I do, then why not take my scientific knowledge and reflect upon my belief that God created the universe and me? And that's what I do. And it's very coherent to me. I don't think it pollutes my scientific knowledge. And I don't think it should be a challenge to my scientific faith. See, the problem many times with religious believers, and many times with the church itself, there's a fear of scientific knowledge, that somehow or other, if we know too much, there's not going to be a place for God. And that's because people sense that God is someone I need. So we want to have not complete knowledge, so that I need God to help me understand. And that's a very poor God.
That's the God of the gaps.
That's the God of the gaps as far as scientific knowledge goes. But it's the gap, it's the God of many, I must say, many religious believers. I have many close Catholic friends who pray that we scientists will not find answers to all these questions so that they can believe in God. Well, that's the dumbest kind of attitude I've ever heard. God gave us brains to try and understand the universe that he made. And science cannot, of its very what it is, science by its very methods can neither exclude nor include God, because science seeks for natural explanations to natural happenings, natural events. And God is not, okay, material. God cannot be investigated in that way, so he can neither be excluded or included. And the fear that he can be, because some scientists do exclude or include, is unfounded. Oh, I admit there are many scientists who preach an atheism as if it were part of their science. They're not doing science.
Could you briefly explain evolution, creationism, and intelligent design?
Well, evolution, scientific evolution, is that from the careful study of paleontology, geology, the history of the earth, the history of living organisms on the earth, we have very strong scientific evidence that all living systems have a common ancestor. So that's number one. Number two, that all species came about over a long period of time through, okay, changes in the organisms, and those changes were subjected to the environment in which these organisms lived, so that the organisms that could best adapt to their environment and therefore survived continued into the future. And that's why we have different species. That one species, okay, evolved into another species because of changes that were created organisms that best adapted. Okay, so we started with little amoeba, and we got fish, and we got crawling creatures, and you know the characterization. Sometimes it's caricaturized, but the characterization of without going into all the details, that's evolution. Intelligent design proposes that there are some organisms, living organisms, that are so complex that they could not have come to be except by having all the parts prepared and then put together, like you put together an automobile. You have all the cares. And someone had to intelligently design that, to put it together, because it's such a complicated organism. That's the contrast between intelligent design and evolution. Intelligent design is really a religious movement that requires an intelligent designer. It's another God of the gaps being brought in to explain something that we can now explain by evolution.
You're not happy about this intelligent design movement,
No,
are you?
not at all. It's a religious movement. And it's a creationist kind of movement. So you said, what is creationism? Creationism in its most fundamental form is a use of interpreting Scripture in order to make sure that God is involved in the whole process of human beings and the earth and everything coming to be. So the earth is 6,000 years old because in Scripture you can date certain times when the flood occurred and all of this. It's a reading of Scripture in a literal scientific sense, which is not justified.
You say that intelligent design belittles God. In what way?
Well, it makes God a designer, and God is a lover. To be honest with you, God is a lover. God is not a designer. God made a universe that has within it the dynamism to design itself. That does not escape God's control. Okay? It glorifies God, as I said before. Because if God is, it makes God an engineer or a designer. And a poor one at that. It's a poor design.
Yes, sometimes it is.
I mean, why do I get the flu? Why did children die of leukemia? Why do we have hurricanes and tornadoes that kill thousands of people if God designed this universe to be this way? So it's a poor designer.
Father COYNE, you have expressed your opinions about intelligent design very strongly. already mentioned that you said it belittles God. Well, the late Pope John Paul II, he already said in 1996, I believe, that evolution is no longer a mere hypothesis. But then, by way of contrast, in 2005, Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna claimed that neo-Darwinism was not compatible with God as a creator. So what is your stand in this debate, as I can name it?
Yeah, it's a debate, and it's going on. My first comment is that Cardinal Schönborn sent me, maybe the following Christmas, a very nice little Christmas card in which he said, Father COYNE, I'm very sorry that this has become a public issue. He said that neo-Darwinian evolution, okay, as a pure random chance process is incompatible with Catholic teaching. He's wrong on two accounts. It is not it's not a purely random chance process, number one. And it is not incompatible with Catholic teaching, because from within science, nothing can be incompatible with good science. Nothing. Because science is neutral with respect to all else that is said about these processes. What I'm trying to say is that to say it's incompatible with Catholic teaching is to deny the very methodology of science. Those scientists who use science as a platform for preaching a materialism or a purely chance process, and therefore denying that God had anything to do with it, are the real adversaries
of science.
That's correct. And the unfortunate thing is I think churchmen like Cardinal Schönborn, who are very wise and very intelligent, first of all, I must say, give me the impression they do not understand science, okay, when they say such things as being incompatible with. But secondly, in all their wisdom, there's this returning fear of we're going to lose God. God's going to lose control of all of this if we let scientists continue to. They don't identify their adversaries are not sciences. They're atheistic scientists who use their science as a platform.
You're very strong about that, and you speak out. So I very much appreciate your way of dealing with it as a scientist and as a priest. But couldn't you say that the Darwinian evolutionary theory leads to atheism? There is no God involved in the process. So a lot of persons claim that these theories lead to atheism. Now, is this true? Does it automatically lead to a non-belief? Absolutely
not. I don't know what you mean by leads to atheism. It's a purely scientific explanation. First of all, it's not a theory. I'm afraid, at least in American English, theory becomes, it's only a theory. It's the best scientific explanation we have for the origins of the human being and everything else in the universe. If you have a better scientific explanation, and I'm speaking to your audience and anyone else, please give it to us. We're dying to have, because we know it's inadequate. That's what makes science so interesting, because we never have the final answer. And there are many lacunae in explaining the evolutionary process to the human being, many. But every time we get more evidence, it becomes stronger. We find a little creature that came out of the water, and it couldn't breathe for long out of the water, and it didn't have claws, so it went back in the water. But it got to kind of like land, so over a very long period of time, it developed lungs or a breathing process, okay, and it developed claws. And we've recently, within the past 5 years, find those intermediate creatures, okay, that have fins to swim and they have claws to climb on land. So, I mean, all of this, and especially molecular biology. I mean, you can tell I'm passionate about this, but the whole genetic code is more and more supporting neo-Darwinian evolution. There are many lacunae in the paleontological record, in the geological records, and all many lacunae. And that's why we're still investigating.
You're very clear about not mixing science with religion, or not trying to find a God in scientific processes. So
Or exclude a God.
Or exclude.
Thank you. It does not lead to atheism.
No.
And I'm afraid that you really kind of hit the issues, this idea that a fear of science because it leads to atheism.
Yes, that's true. That's what I wanted you to
Science
have your
is
opinion
self-sufficient.
about. Yes.
Science knows it all. It can explain it all. Any good scientist knows how inadequate.
Every good scientist.
Every good scientist.
Yes.
I mean by good,
Yeah.
that respects the limits of the scientific method.
What future space missions do you consider most important?
I think, to be very specific, I think those space missions, and they're being designed now, they're being thought of, that will detect small planets like the Earth and will have the capability of analyzing their atmosphere. So we have the Planet Explorer program that at least NASA in the United States and the European Space Agency is participating in planning spacecraft, because to get the high resolution we need to get outside the perturbations in the Earth's atmosphere. Although we're using technologies now where on the surface of the Earth we can correct for a great deal of these perturbations. Nonetheless, I think the space missions will look for Earth-like planets is one of the most exciting that could happen.
I wish you a very exciting period to come, Father George
Never
COYNE.
dull. It's never dull.
Thank you very much for being
Good
with
to
us.
be with you,
Have a
Lucette.
safe trip
Thank
home.
you. Thanks very much.